Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 564. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of important news to talk about in today's show, including some breaking news on the Julian Assange appeal. So be sure to share today's show because we have a lot of important stuff to get through. It's at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and of course you can always find my content by following me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. Let's get into the news. As I said, some breaking news in the Assange case. The UK High Court has ruled on his appeal request, and they have really split and not granted the full appeal, but opened the window to doing so. So what the court said is that on 2 or 3 particular grounds involving the First Amendment and the death penalty, they're now going to look to get additional assurances from Washington before moving ahead with the extradition. And if Washington doesn't apply those assurances and they have 3 weeks to do so, then it would go into a full appeal. Now, if Washington provides the assurances, there's going to be a hearing, I guess, on May 20th for the Assange legal team to, I guess, question if those assurances given by Washington really do meet the standard of what the UK is asking for. So I'm not sure that you could classify this as a win for the Assange team. Certainly not a full loss either, although I think they did lose on some of the important grounds they were hoping to appeal on, such as being able to bring up the fact that the CIA had plotted to assassinate Julian Assange. They wanted to bring that up to the UK High Court, and they got denied the appeal, the portion of their appeal that would have allowed them to discuss that. So definitely not a full win, definitely not a full loss. Hopefully we still get some good news here for Julian. There is still this issue that kind of seems like it's on maybe the back burner now of the White House considering some kind of plea deal for Assange. I mean, he shouldn't have to agree to that. I'm not sure it would be a good thing, if he takes a plea deal because of the legal precedent sets in the field of journalism. However, we also got to consider the man here, Julian, too, and he really needs to be out of jail and with his family. All right, let's move on here. And, every time we talk about WikiLeaks, I do like to point out that there are so many things going on in our government today, whether it's the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, or a lot of other government malfeasance, that you have to imagine if WikiLeaks was functioning at its full strength, and what should have happened when WikiLeaks became popular is that we ended up with more WikiLeaks, right? Rather than the persecution of the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, which is what we're dealing with and talking about right now. And so because of that persecution, because of the fact that there's not more WikiLeaks, I think we have so much more corruption in our government because there's no real free independent press. All right, so first article up here today, the Department of Defense used $300 million in savings to send arms to Ukraine while facing a $10 billion deficit. So over the past few months, the White House has employed multiple budgetary schemes to free up funds to send weapons to Ukraine. Last year, the Joe Biden administration sent $300 million in weapons to Ukraine using money that was authorized by Congress this past weekend. Earlier this month, the Department of Defense claimed to have cut costs on some contracts, freeing up more funds for Kiev. So earlier this month, this seems to be the more egregious violation here. The White House announced a $300 million arms package to Ukraine that included cluster bombs, and that was announced on March 12th. At the end of last year, the White House announced that it had depleted its available funds to send weapons to Kiev, raising questions on the accounting tactics used to free up the money. According to the AP, the Department of Defense claimed to have saved $300 million by cutting costs on other procurement contracts. However, the Pentagon also reports a $10 billion deficit in funds needed to buy weapons to replenish depleted U.S. arms depots. Over the past 2 years, the White House has drained U.S. stockpiles down to redline levels to wage a proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. So this is what the AP said. It is unclear whether the Pentagon could have put that $300 million towards the $10 billion replenishment deficit. Instead, there are congressional controls on how different funding lines can be used. But with Ukrainian troops running out of ammunition in their fight against Russia and no signs that funding impasse in Congress will end soon, the Biden administration opted to use the savings to help its struggling ally. So this seems to be a pretty egregious abuse of executive power, where, we do have Congress here who has not acted on approving additional funding for Ukraine, even though there's a bill that was specifically allow them to do so. So this would seem to be in the category, there's a Supreme Court ruling, I'm not sure which one. I would have to have like Patrick McFarland on the show to help me break this down a little bit more. But there's a Supreme Court ruling that says that when you have executive power, and that executive power is acting in the interest of Congress, then the executive has quite a bit of power. But when the executive is acting against the interest of power, then it has quite a bit less executive power. And so if Congress is specifically not passing an additional aid bill for Ukraine, which is the case, that is specifically blocked right now in the House, then that should mean that the president can't just find additional money to send arms to Ukraine, because that's against the will of Congress. Now, I don't expect anybody to bring this to the Supreme Court or to ever really to be called into question, but this should be a real issue for Americans. The government here is really just taking money that Congress specifically hasn't authorized to fight a war, in a war that Congress hasn't even approved to fight, and they're just sending money that they find, they find in other places, in an agency, by the way, that can't pass an audit and has never passed an audit either. So the idea that you're just finding $300 million laying around that's not needed elsewhere is just a lie to the American people that is completely egregious. So this is not the first instance of the Biden administration resorting to questionable accounting to expedite funds to Ukraine without congressional approval. Last summer, the Pentagon claimed to have discovered a $6 billion accounting error in its pool of funds to support Kiev's war effort. In November, the White House again used $300 million in funds for Ukraine that had not actually been approved by Congress until the legislator passed the $1.2 trillion spending bill on Saturday. And so this one seems to be maybe the gray area one to me, where Congress passed a temporary spending bill, which, just funds the government at the previous levels. And the White House said, oh, well, last year you allowed us to spend $300 billion through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And so we're going to say that you're going to allow us to spend $300 million on that in this coming year. And since you continued last year's spending, then we could do this. Again, this is a lie to the American people. It's certainly, not how government is supposed to function, but at least with that one, you could kind of imagine how they get to their solution, where with the $300 million in savings when they're writing a $10 billion deficit is just an insult to the American people to say that to our faces. Additionally, the $4 billion accounting error is also highly questionable, since there's now a $10 billion deficit. It seems like maybe the accounting error is the $3.6 billion in additional weapons that the U.S. sent to Ukraine without having the funds to replace. All right, so while the White House officials are urging the House to act on the $95 billion foreign spending bill, a solution to the deadlock appears distant. Discussing the legislation, House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mike Rogers said, "We're in a bad place. I'm discussing options with some other members. We need to put something on the floor." Rep. Adam Smith, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, stated he believes Republicans do not have a plan for passing the legislation with additional aid for Kiev. They do not have an alternative. They're still trying to imagine door number 3 exists. Door number 1, give us a vote on the Senate bill. Door number 2, give Putin Ukraine. The congressman continued, they don't want to do either of those, so they're trying to imagine there's a door number 3. We have to let them know that there is not. And so The Republicans seem to be in a real bind here. I don't think Congress is back in session until after Easter, and so that would be early next week. I'm not sure what's going to happen here. As I have said, when people have asked me, the judge has asked me a few times when I've been on his show, which, by the way, I will be back on Judging Freedom Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So tune in live if you can. If not, I really recommend checking it out. I get really good feedback on those interviews. And if you can, leave a positive comment in the section on the YouTube video. That definitely helps me to keep getting to go back on that show. So, yeah, anyways, I do imagine that they will eventually pass this funding. The war state rarely loses on something they care so much about, but at the same time, I still don't see the solution to this impasse. But again, maybe the political narrative will shift suddenly over the weekend, and it will become very clear by Monday. All right, next up here, U.S. resolution on Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal fails at UN. I wrote this one for the Institute on March 22nd, and this is there's two UN resolutions we're going to be talking about. One was introduced on Friday. That's this one. This is the U.S. resolution. And then there was another one that actually passed on Monday. So we'll talk about that next. China and Russia used their veto power at the UN Security Council to kill a U.S.-sponsored resolution that said there was a need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, with other countries arguing its language was watered down. The U.S. previously rejected a series of resolutions that demanded a ceasefire. On Friday, the Security Council voted 11-3-1 on the resolution, with Russia and China choosing to veto it. Algeria, the primary sponsor of previous ceasefire resolutions, also voted against the motion. During her remarks to the UN Security Council, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said that Washington wanted an immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza. However, critics of the resolution say the text actually gives Israel a green light to continue the onslaught. Explaining his country's opposition after the vote, the Algerian ambassador, Ben Jama, said the text submitted to the vote today was not a clear message of peace. It would have allowed more Palestinians to be killed. Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, Trita Parsi, observed that the measure includes Israel demands with core Palestinian interests are worded ambiguously. He said the text points out that this effort to secure a ceasefire in connection with the release of all remaining hostages, this is an Israeli demand that is not likely to be accepted by Hamas in return for a time-limited ceasefire rather than a permanent one. And that was in a post on X. He also wrote an article for the Quincy Institute on this. That was very good. Russia's permanent representative to the UN said the motion was part of a show put on by the U.S. The UN Security Council has been unable to pass a document demanding a ceasefire in Gaza for 6 months. All attempts have run up against the wall of U.S. resistance. Even now, we are witnessing typical hypocritical show where the U.S. is trying to sell something in disguise as a ceasefire, which is in fact a formula for determining a ceasefire imperative. And that was a part of the issue here. There was actually something in the resolution that was saying, well, if this happened and that happened and that happened, then you could have a ceasefire. And it obviously wasn't going to be something that was going to be accepted. The Chinese ambassador argued that the U.S. resolution implicitly authorized further Israeli operations in Gaza. He said the U.S. resolution is evasive on the core issue of a ceasefire. The final text remains vague, failing to call for an immediate ceasefire, even providing an answer to how to achieve one in the short term. Instead, the U.S. draft sets preconditions for a ceasefire, which are tantamount to giving a green light to continue killing and is unacceptable. The U.S. has voted against 3 previous resolutions calling for a ceasefire and other motions at the UN Security Council that would have condemned Israeli actions in Gaza, such as the February 29th flower massacre that left more than 100 Palestinians dead. Justifying those votes, Thomas Greenfield claimed that the calls for a ceasefire would have undermined Washington's efforts to achieve a deal to release the hostages still held by Hamas. Obviously, now, that we're months later, we know that this was either a lie or just really stupid strategy on the White House's part, because we still haven't gotten that ceasefire. While the White House is fixated on achieving a hostage deal to end the fighting, Tel Aviv has repeatedly stated it will not end its offensive operations until it eliminates Hamas. Israeli officials say to achieve that goal, it must launch an assault on Rafah. Aid agencies warn an attack on the city of 1.5 million will lead to utter devastation. The Chinese ambassador said the U.S. resolution did not even condemn a potential attack on Rafah. The draft does not clearly express opposition to an attack on Rafah, which will send a very wrong signal and be serious consequences, he told the UN Security Council. Now, let's talk about the ceasefire resolution that did pass. Dave DeCamp wrote this for antiwar.com on Monday. The UN Security Council on Monday adopted a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for Ramadan and the release of all hostages. The U.S. abstained from this vote, and the 14 other members of the Security Council voted in favor of the resolution. The U.S. had previously vetoed 3 resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. On Friday, China and Russia vetoed a U.S.-authored resolution that said it was an imperative for a ceasefire, in Gaza, but only in connection with the release of hostages. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Thomas Greenfield, said the U.S. didn't vote in favor of the resolution passed on Monday because it didn't agree with all the language. We did not agree with everything in the resolution, she said. Certain key edits were ignored, including our request to add a condemnation of Hamas, which is just stupid 6 months into a genocide. And, the U.S. votes on the Security Council here. While, look, the Security Council isn't this all-powerful body that some people pretend it is, and just because it votes for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, it could have voted for one in October, and it wouldn't necessarily have meant that a ceasefire would have been achieved right away. Israel is really only going to listen to the U.S. They're not going to listen to the UN or the UN Security Council. And so what the UN Security Council resolution does is it applies more political pressure and allows Americans to apply more political pressure on our government, on the Biden administration, to break ties with Israel. And we'll get into, how this is actually building in the U.S. and playing out right now a little later in the show. But the idea that, the U.S. is still not voting in favor of this is just a really disgusting stain on Americans' legacy. And I really hope that, this is, I don't hope that this is what Biden is known for, because I don't want my country to be known for committing a genocide. But this is the most, along with the war in Ukraine, substantial thing the Biden administration has done. And both of those wars have been absolute failures. And, if we look back at past presidents, not Trump because it's still a little too fresh for people, but if you look back at Obama, Democrats love to say, oh, the only scandal was he wore a tan suit or some nonsense about his family. Or they'll even go back to George W. Bush now and say, oh, remember when politics were more normal and things like that. So, I really hope that Biden's legacy is defined by this genocide that not only he has supported in Gaza now, but over his entire, 50-year career, he has basically supported the conditions to emerge in Israel, the oppression, the apartheid in Israel, to emerge and take hold that led to, not only the events of October 7th, but the conditions where Israel now feels comfortable conducting such a ruthless and brutal military occupation in Gaza day after day. So the Israelis, I guess somewhat unsurprisingly, are not very happy about the UN Security Council telling them not to have a ceasefire, and the U.S. not vetoing that ceasefire resolution. So during a visit to Washington on Monday, Israeli Defense Minister Gallant responded to the UN Security Council passing a resolution that called for a Ramadan ceasefire, saying Israel had no moral right to stop its brutal military operations. We have no moral right to stop the war in Gaza until we return all the hostages to their homes. If we don't reach a clear and absolute victory in Gaza, it could bring war in the north closer. While Gallant signaled Israel could stop if all the hostages are released, Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly said his goal is to eradicate Hamas, which the U.S. and Israeli intelligence believe is unrealistic. Israel has also refused to engage in Hamas's demands for a peace deal that would free all Israeli hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and the release of a lot of Palestinian prisoners. The UN Security Council resolution called for an unconditional release of the hostages, but did not make it a condition for a ceasefire. Gallant called the resolution scandalous and said that he would tell the National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan the importance of bringing down the Hamas regime. Gallant said he will use his time in the U.S. to push for more support for the Israeli military. I am now opening my visit to Washington as a representative of the State of Israel and on behalf of the government of Israel. I came here to clarify the need to strengthen the IDF and strengthen the State of Israel. So he's going to ask for more money. Basically, no different than what Zelensky would do had he come to the U.S. So while Gallant says Israel has no moral ability to stop the war in Gaza, they are certainly doing some very immoral things during that war. Israel bars UNRWA aid shipments to northern Gaza as region nears famine. The head of the UN aid agency for Palestinians said that Israel barred all shipments of assistance to northern Gaza. The international watchdog on food crisis warned that a famine will be official in northern Gaza in the coming weeks. On Sunday, UNRWA Commissioner General Felipe Lanzare said Tel Aviv made clear that the agency would no longer be allowing aid to be delivered to northern Gaza. Despite the tragedy unfolding under our watch, the Israeli authorities informed the UN that they no longer will approve any UNRWA food convoys to the north. This is outrageous and makes it intentional to obstruct life-saving assistance during a man-made famine. The head of UNRWA explained that Israel rejected 2 UNRWA shipments to northern Gaza last week, and that the agency has been unable to get Tel Aviv's approval for a shipment to the region during the past 2 months. The International Watchdog on Food Insecurity, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, released a new report on Monday saying famine in Gaza will begin within the next 2 months. For famine to be declared, at least 2 per 10,000 people must be dying of deprivation per day. The latest evidence confirms that famine is imminent in northern governance of the Gaza Strip and projected to occur anytime between mid-March and May 2024, the IPC report found. The entire population in the Gaza Strip is facing high levels of acute food insecurity. This includes half of the population in IPC Phase 5, which is labeled catastrophe, an increase of 530,000 people. That's up 92% from their previous analysis. UNRWA has the largest distribution network and humanitarian infrastructure in Gaza. Lanzare points out, UNRWA is the largest organization with the highest reach to displaced communities in Gaza. By preventing UNRWA from fulfilling its mandate in Gaza, the clock will tip faster towards famine, and many more will die of hunger, dehydration, and lack of shelter. Tel Aviv and Washington have sought to constrain the aid agency as a humanitarian nightmare is worsening in Gaza. In January, Israel claimed that members of UNRWA took part in the October 7th attack and that thousands of UNRWA employees had links to Hamas. While Israel produced no evidence to back its assertions, Secretary of State Antony Blinken labeled the accusations highly credible, and the U.S. cut funding for UNRWA. On Saturday, a $1.2 trillion spending bill was approved by Congress that prohibits Washington from funding the Palestinian aid agency. The Israeli accusations against UNRWA have faced increased scrutiny in recent weeks, as employees of the aid agency have said they were tortured into falsely stating there were ties between the organization and Hamas. So this is an UNRWA spokesperson responding to the cutting off of aid from the U.S., the bill. Some of our staff conveyed that UNRWA teams said that they were forced to make confessions under torture and ill treatment. These false confessions were in response to questioning about relations between UNRWA and Hamas and involvement in October 7th attack against Israel, the UNRWA spokeswoman said. And Reuters has reported they've seen portions of that report, and those allegations do include that Israel waterboarded the Palestinians. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp. Government funding bill signed by Biden includes $3.8 billion in military aid for Israel and cuts funding to UNRWA. So the $1.2 trillion government spending funding package that Biden signed into law on Saturday includes $3.8 billion in annual military aid for Israel and also cuts funding for the UN Palestinian Aid Relief Agency, UNRWA, as Gaza is on the brink of famine. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year under a 10-year memorandum of understanding signed by the Biden administration, which I can never really understand why the U.S. would sign a pledge to give Israel arms for the next 10 years. You know, if we want to do this annually, then Congress could approve it annually, but there's no reason that we should guarantee to Tel Aviv over 10 years that they're going to get this money. How stupid is that? The pro-Israel American lobbying group AIPAC celebrated the signing of the bill and noted that the military aid for Israel is still unconditional. Congress just passed and President Biden signed into law $3.3 billion in vital security assistance for Israel without added political conditions. AIPAC wrote on X, "This life-saving support will help keep our allies safe and ensure Israel has the resources it needs to protect its families." Now, one other interesting thing I should note that I saw on AIPAC's X account, and I was just looking at it a few days ago because I'm working on doing something about AIPAC, because they've been bragging a lot on X about how all their candidates are winning their elections, which, you know, I think is interesting. But one thing they specifically noted in one candidate and race they highlighted was they helped Danny Davis, who is the representative and has been for, I think, the past 30 years of Illinois' 7th congressional district. He was running against a couple candidates, including a woman named Keena Collins. Now, it stuck out to me because I actually attended college with Keena. We were in a at least one freshman class together. I remember meeting her, you know, very early on, and I did not attend some elite institution. We were at Carthage College, a very small campus of about 3,000 people in Kenosha, Wisconsin, so a little north of Chicago. And, you know, just seeing AIPAC attack and spend apparently $500,000 to defeat her campaign because she said that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza and called for a ceasefire, is just so outrageous and shows the extent of the problems that we have in this country with foreign lobbies meddling in our internal politics. That, you know, you have this group just dumping huge amounts of money in against all these political candidates. And I mean, it's so pervasive that even I went to college with one of these candidates that are getting shut down by AIPAC. So the U.S. continues to provide Israel with unconditional military aid despite the massive civilian casualties in Gaza and Israel's restriction on aid, which has caused severe levels of food insecurity among the Strip's entire population. In contrast, the U.S. immediately suspended aid to UNRWA after Israel claimed without evidence that 12 of its employees participated in the October 7th attack. And you could imagine, right, if this was the Trump administration, that every time the Israelis had any claim, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how many times they claim mass rape, beheaded babies, you know, all these other alleged claims that Hamas had burned all these Israeli bodies that turned out were people that were killed by Israeli weapons when the Israelis, you know, fired on the civilians and Hamas. All those lies, right? And it doesn't even begin to creep into the minds of the swamp creatures in Washington that, hey, the Israelis are lying to you and spinning war propaganda, probably not unlike the Ukrainians did in the early days of the war, whether it was the ghost of Kiev, the tank that was running over cars in downtown Kiev, the Bucha massacre, all these little things that they claim were, you know, major incidents and got the U.S. more and more involved in these wars, turned out to be lies. And there's never any thought within the, you know, Biden administration like, hey, we should reconsider this. And also, you know, you really imagine here that this is the Trump administration, right? That every time the white Israelis tell you that these horrific crimes, beheaded babies, mass rapes, were committed at the hands of the brown Palestinians. And every time the brown Palestinians make any claim against the white Israelis, you don't say anything. I think there would probably be massive liberal protests in the United States and regular calls against the Trump administration that not only is what they're doing racist, but to demand it to be stopped, something like we saw with Black Lives Matter. As it is, we have at least, in name liberal Democratic president in office, and so the liberals aren't too interested in protesting and calling their leadership racist. And so 6 months into this genocide, we have, some finally small critiques of what's going on from House Democrats. So House Democrats tell Biden to enforce U.S. laws and suspend military aid to Israel. 6 senior House Democrats sent a letter to President Biden on Saturday urging him to invoke U.S. foreign assistance laws to suspend military aid to Israel due to the country's starvation blockade of Gaza. Given the catastrophic and devolving humanitarian situation in Gaza, we urge you to enforce the humanitarian aid corridor and as required by that law, make it clear to the Israeli government that so long as Israel continues to restrict the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza, the U.S. continued provision of U.S. security assistance to Israel would constitute a violation of existing U.S. law and must be restricted. Again, this isn't like some huge thing. This is a congressional letter by a few congressmen sent to the White House. However, it is important that there is some mounting concern here. Now, it's kind of hard not to note some of the hypocrisy here, particularly as James McGovern is one of the signatories of this letter and is also pushing for the $95 billion foreign aid bill that would give $14 billion in weapons to Israel. So, I don't see this as a real amount of resistance. And, not that there aren't Americans out there protesting. I've celebrated on the show the people going out and calling Joe Biden Genocide Joe. It's just, these protests are not loud enough for the scale of death that our government is participating in. All right, U.S. claims Israel following international law, not blocking aid. This one from Dave DeCamp, March 25th, antiwar.com. The State Department claimed on Monday that Israel is using U.S. weapons without violating international law or U.S. law despite massive civilian casualties in Gaza and the starvation blockade imposed on the Strip. Under the National Security Memorandum, the U.S. requires countries armed with U.S. weapons to provide assurances that they won't violate international law or block humanitarian assistance. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant gave the assurances in a letter that he issued earlier this month, which it's just the biggest joke, right? This is the guy who said that they would not allow food, water, fuel, other aid into Gaza at the start of this war, and Israel has done everything that they could to make that possible. They have severely constricted the amount of aid getting into Gaza to the point where the U.S. is regularly dropping aid over the skies of Gaza that's falling into the ocean, falling into the hands of the Israelis, causing a lot of chaos and confusion on the streets of northern Gaza, not helping the situation really at all. But we take assurance from Gallant that, hey, Israel isn't doing this as they're 100% doing it. And as we're seeing time and time again, that Israel is just massively bombing Gaza. All right, so some interesting statements by Trump on the war in Gaza. Former President Trump said in an interview with an Israeli outlet over the weekend that Israel made a big mistake by broadcasting images and videos of the destruction of the Gaza Strip, saying Israel is losing a lot of support. Trump said he would have done the same thing as Israel in response to the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel, but said it was time to finish your war as global opposition is turning on Israel. You've got to get it done, and I'm sure you will do that, and we've got to get to peace. We can't have this going on. I will say Israel has to be very careful because you're losing a lot of you're losing a lot of support. You've got to finish up. You've got to get the job done, Trump said. I gotta say, I missed reading Trump's statements on the show. They're always so fun to read. When asked by the interviewer about how he would respond to the wave of anti-Semitism since October 7th, Trump replied, "Well, that's because you fought back, and I think Israel made a very big mistake. I wanted to call Israel and say, don't do that. The photos and shots, I mean moving shots of bombs being dropped into buildings in Gaza, and I say, oh, that's a terrible portrait. It's a very bad picture for the world. The world is seeing this every night. I would watch buildings pour down on people," Trump said. And it is interesting that Trump does, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm wrong about this, that Biden, I don't think he probably looks at very many of the pictures and images of the destruction of Gaza. But that is something that Trump seemed to do even throughout his presidency. Like, people would show him pictures of dead children, and he would seem to be a little bit moved by it. So, you know, I'm not saying that Trump would not have done what Biden did, or maybe even worse. I think the policy would have played out differently, I guess. I think had this happened and Trump was president on October 7th, he would have been far more vocal in how much support he would give Israel and about how much he loved Israel. It may have made 2 or 3 trips to Israel during the first couple of months. I think political pressure in the US would have forced Trump to put some red lines on Israel. And I think Trump would have followed through with them to the point where the war would have been over by this point. I think that, absolutely very large portions of Gaza and 10,000 or so people would certainly be dead under the Trump plan. But this Biden plan of, oh, we're going to give aid to the Palestinians while we're also giving more weapons to the Israelis has really allowed for this just to linger on. And now we're having famine sent in, and that's created an even worse and maybe potentially more lethal situation. So during the interview, the interviewer claimed that terrorists were hiding in the buildings, and Trump replied, "Go and do what you have to do, but you don't do that." And I think that's one of the reasons that there has always been a lot of kickback. If people don't see that every single night, I've watched every single one of those, and I think Israel wanted to show that it's tough, but sometimes you shouldn't be doing that. Trump also took shots at the Democrats for the growing criticisms of Israel from within the party. Some 15 years ago, Israel had the strongest lobby. If you were a politician, you couldn't say anything bad about Israel. That would be like the end of your political career. Today, it's almost the opposite. I've never seen you have AOC plus 3, these lunatics, frankly, but you have AOC plus 3, plenty of others, and they all they do is talk badly about Israel. They all hate Israel, and they all hate Jewish people, he said, which of course isn't true. But this is one of the other great things about the Trump presidency, right? Isn't his insults of the squad. That's not what I'm referring to, but this idea that, he's just openly saying that at one point in time, Israel had so much control over what was happening in the US that no members of Congress would ever talk bad about the Israeli state. Absolutely crazy admission. All right, so this one from Data Camp. Data shows Israel gets 99% of its weapons from the U.S. and Germany. Amid growing calls for the U.S. to stop arming Israel, data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, that SPIRI, has shown that Israel gets 99% of its weapons from the U.S. and Germany. I think the U.S. account for 69%, while Germany 30%. And maybe Canada or the UK was like 0.5%. Whatever shipments that Canada was giving have now been shut off. But as you see there, it pretty much only matters if the US were to turn off the weapon pipelines to Israel. All right, so next up here is a pretty interesting story from Haaretz, and it details a Israeli troop withdrawal from southern Israel in the days leading up to October 7th. And what this article really explains is almost this standoff / tactical deployment going on between Hamas and Tel Aviv, reportedly before October 7th. Haaretz relies on Israeli sources for this. So it could be that there are some cover-ups in here. Maybe it's somewhat of a limited hangout, but Haaretz has done some pretty good reporting on this, and some of it, did seem to make sense. So what Haaretz is reporting is that in September, Israel started to get pretty nervous about what Hamas was up to, and they did think that Hamas was going to launch an attack to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. So they're getting ready for this, and they actually stack a lot more troops and resources into southern Israel in late September. And Hamas responds to this by cutting all of their military activities. So in the lead up here, they said part of the reason they were concerned is Hamas was doing things that seemed to be testing the Israeli security defenses and seeing what the limits of those were. But then when Israel deployed their forces, Hamas stopped doing that. And so the Israelis took this as, they've been effectively deterred, and now we could redeploy our forces elsewhere, primarily towards the West Bank, where the Tel Aviv was engaging in a lot of provocations against the Palestinians there, and we'll get into some of that coming up next. And in response, they were concerned about the Palestinians protesting or fighting back against the Israelis, and so they wanted to have a heavy amount of troops there. So they redeployed the troops from southern Israel to the West Bank, and then Hamas goes through with the attack, and that explains the success. At least that's the explanation in that Haaretz article. All right, next up here, this one from Will Porter. Israel seizes West Bank land for future settlements. The Israeli government has confiscated a swath of territory in the occupied West Bank to make way for a new settlement block. The designation of 2,000 acres as state land, the decision comes weeks after Tel Aviv greenlit the construction of thousands of additional settlement units beyond the Green Line. Finance Minister Smotrich announced the important and strategic move on Friday, saying some 1,980 acres of land in the northern Jordan Valley have been approved for future development. While there are those in Israel and the world who seek to undermine our right to Judea and Samaria, which is what Israel calls the West Bank, and the country in general, we promote the settlement movement with hard work and in strategic manners across the country, which is absolutely crazy that, he's openly talking about this, promoting the settler movement, because the settlements are specifically against international law, but Israel just keeps moving forward with them anyway. The designation will allow for the construction of more than 100 settlement units in the Jordan Valley, as well as a commercial and industrial zone, according to the Israeli broadcaster Khan. Under the Israeli law, labeling territory state land creates a pretext for the future expansion of settlement communities in the West Bank, long considered a flagrant violation of international law by the United Nations and other rights groups. According to the Israeli settlement watchdog Peace Now, the land grab marks the largest seizure in the West Bank since the signing of the ill-fated Oslo Accords in 1993. The group said the declaration of state land is one of the main methods by which the state of Israel seeks to assert its control over land in the occupied territories. Land declared as state land is no longer considered private property owned by Palestinians in the eyes of Israel, and they are prevented from using it. Additionally, the state leases the land exclusively to Israelis. And it's so appalling to have these kind of policies of intentional property distribution to a certain ethnic group to create an ethnic cleansing, fats on the ground type situation. This was a dark part of American history, trying to control where black people were allowed to live in order to, allow white people to essentially have all white communities, right? This is redlining and a practice that is outlawed, I think, nationally in most states as well. And it's so interesting that in recent weeks, Israel has tried to hold events at American synagogues where they would sell property in Israel, but it would only be allowed to go to Jews, not Palestinians, which should be highly problematic. And I do wonder if any of these states will take some action here just because it's, kind of an affront to America's legacy to allow this to happen on American soil. All right, everybody, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I'll be back with another show tomorrow. Again, I'm back on with the judge at Tuesday at 4 Eastern, and then Connor will be on the judge's show Wednesday, and hopefully I'll have him on the show later this week as well. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Talk to you soon.